Hi, I'm Hales and I'm demonstrating a snow scene for you today. Snow scenes can be challenging because there's a lot of white space and almost a monochromatic hue. So the challenge is to create a sense of distance and also to introduce some variety within that limited colour palette. I see this landscape as having 4 levels: the sky, the background hill, the middle distance, and then the foreground slope. And so my plan is to try and establish these areas on the page, which is the basis of my design, before I get too involved with the trees that are in this landscape. I'll start with the sky, and I don't need to draw the hill line. It's pretty simple. I can just paint the sky and establish a sense of blueness with cloud, because we've got shadows on the snow, so they have to come from somewhere. So I'll establish a bit of crisp blue sky and some cloud. I don't mind where the sky stops. I'm working on quite an angle here, so there's a little bit of distortion as you're watching. And the paper surface is a Winsor & watercolour paper, cold press. Now all I'm going to do here is to continue anything that is not white on the paddock, except for the trees. So any nuances that I can see in the hillside, any changes in levels, I will start to indicate those. I want to establish the form of the land, because I find it much easier to plant the trees when I know what shape the hillside is. And I find it easier to relate one group of trees to another if I know where the land is sitting and how it is formed. These are the shadow areas, and they show me the contour of the landmass. I'm adding a little bit of extra dark here, and although it looks too dark to be the shadows on the hillside, you'll probably notice when I finish that it is nowhere near as dark as what my photograph is. A little bit of textural disturbance in the snow in the foreground. When you're looking at this scene, there should already be a sense of space established because of the warmth of the hue, the closeness of the lines as you get towards the background, and the crispness of the edges in the foreground. Now I'm going to start to plant the trees on the background hillside. And this is about painting a texture that shows the snow-laden ground. So the spaces I leave are as important as the dots and dashes that I paint, because I want the areas of snow to almost flow in between and around these trees. So while I'm painting the darks, I'm very conscious of the kind of light shapes I'm leaving. And I don't need a solid line all along this hilltop. And I don't mind that the colour of the sky has come down onto the hilltop itself. Any of those white spaces left are reading in this particular landscape as snow. I don't really have much control of this brush. It's basically making interesting patterns on the page that I would be hard pressed to make if I were working really consciously. And so there's a lovely informality to the marks that are happening here. I want a little bit of variation of edge quality, so I'm spraying a little to let the paint blend and soften in some areas. Otherwise this whole hillside will finish up very dotty. As I work further down this hillside, I'm deepening the colour and making slightly larger spaces to indicate that I'm a little bit closer. If I paint enough here so that this background hill looks really interesting, when it is just the background to my painting, it will work brilliantly. Once I put my main trees in, I will not notice this section of land anymore. Now I'm starting to just come and modify some of those shadow shapes and some of the edges that I left there. Now I'm starting to add the trees, and I begin with the group furthest in the distance. And what I would normally do is work quite logically through this and paint the ones that are furthest away first and come forward. It doesn't always work that way, but that's the plan. Because I've established the layers in the shadows, where I place my trees will also be linked to where those shadows are. There's another group here that may finish up actually being behind some of the main trees, but I can paint them in, cover them if I wish or not, as I go along. These are of a similar size to the ones on the right hand side that are sitting at the same distance in space. Now I'm jumping down into the mid-foreground, which is a little bit out of sync, but it doesn't matter. And again, I'm placing the trees into the area where the shadow is, so they are firmly grounded in the landscape. And this is why I like to paint my shadows before I put the trees in, if the shadows are forming the folds in the hillside. These shadows are not just about the trees, they're also about the shape of the land. And so they are an important feature in structuring the whole landscape. This little needlepoint squirrel brush has many uses, and I really enjoy painting with it. It has a fat bottom and a very fine tip, and the hairs are long. Now I'm jumping around a bit in the distance, but I'm putting this largest group of trees and again placing them into the shadow areas on the hilltop. By using the brush on the side, it's become quite a wide brush, and I really can't control what's going on here. So I'm getting clumps of foliage. Some of them look nice, some of them don't, but they're not stilted, and I can add to them or lift them off as I feel is needed. And on these trees that are very windswept, a few odd shapes in the clumps of foliage is quite a bonus, actually. By painting all the landscape behind before I do this, then the trees are darker, so they are going to cover everything, and it looks like the landscape continues behind them. I'm just adding here a bit of raw sienna to give a sense of the sunlight shining down the hillside and introduce a little variety into the foliage. This time I'm starting with some of the foliage for this next group of trees, and I'll put the trunks in later. And this foliage is linking the foreground trees to the background trees and covering the hillside. The really fine point of this brush makes beautiful branches. And sometimes I paint it, and sometimes I just lean the brush onto the page and let the pressure on the length create the trunk for me. And you'll notice those 3 trees have a little space of light on the snow between them, and this helps to create that sense of space that we talked about earlier. A little bit of depth where the tree pushes into the snow always helps to anchor it. And we're almost there. Little bit of tufts of grass or something sticking through the snow in the foreground. And I'm not really happy with that central bit in the landscape where there's a triangle of the shadow. I don't get the feel that I'm moving down the hill there, so I might just modify some of that a little. Lifting some off to bring the hillside in front and adding just a few just a little to the shape of that particular flow on the hillside. And a few lines running down to show that there is indeed a slope into that section. And we're just about there, really. The scene is set. I've achieved the sense of space that I was after by the mass of the dark and the little bits of white on the hillside at the back, indicating a snow-covered hillside. I've added a little nuance in the shadows in the different levels of the paddock in front of us. And then I've painted the trees, which are the stars of this particular landscape. And these trees need to be informal, fresh, and untidy. And by just dropping some of that raw sienna into the foliage, I have added to that sense of the sunlight shining on the brilliant snow-covered field. All in all, an exciting little painting. This was done with a group from the Watercolour Society, where we get together for a Zoom session during lockdown. Keeps us on our toes and helps pass the time, and also keeps the connections within our group. Thanks for watching.